got another guitar for the Canadian Builder series here. This is from the legendary Michael Dunn, and it's a Selmer-Style guitar, so we can talk a little bit about those as well. Michael Dunn was born in Quebec and soon got out of there. He went to Vancouver, British Columbia, I believe in his late teens, and switched from playing popular guitar hits of the day to classical music, and soon found himself in the company of Bill Lewis, who was the force behind Luthier's Supply, which is one of the very first guitar-making suppliers. I think he predated Stuart McDonald by a couple of years. That business eventually became Luthier's Mercantile, which unfortunately closed up for good a couple of months back. Anyway, he was introduced to a fellow named George Bowden through Bill. Bowden had a music store in Vancouver and his own line of Spanish-built classical guitars that he was selling. He was getting them built, I think, in Mallorca, very much in the Valencian tradition, fairly inexpensive guitars, and they were having some issues during shipping. A lot of them would arrive needing setups and fret dressing and such. Bill Lewis had been doing that work, but he had something else to do, so he trained Dunn to fix them up. And eventually Michael ended up going to Spain and learning guitar making in the shop that was building them. The idea being that he could do the setups there in the original shop and act as sort of the QC department before they were loaded onto the boat, kind of head off the issues before they arrived. So he spent a couple of years in Spain, got really into the flamenco scene. Eventually he came back and he got into building. He shared a shop with Ray Nurse, who is a huge name in the rediscovery of historical lute building techniques, really fascinating guy. And at some point, someone handed him a Django Reinhardt album, and well, that sort of sent him off in a completely new direction. He'd been teaching for a community college in BC, and this was at a time there were very few academically affiliated guitar building classes. This is like late 60s, early 70s. And well, in that program, he trained some very big names in Canadian lutherie. Shelley Park is probably the most well-known at this point. She also makes Selmer-style guitars. I'm really fond of her work. So what is a Selmer guitar exactly? Well, this may not be the purest example. It's not an exacting copy. People know them through the association with Django Reinhardt, who, along with his musical partner, Stefan Grappelli, the violinist, the primary exponents of French Romany jazz tradition. In the early 30s, Reinhardt started using a guitar that was designed by an Italian classical guitarist and luthier named Mario Macaferri. Fairly large guitars with a cutaway, which is very novel for a flat top at that point in history. They have long scales. The ones designed by Mario have a broad D-shaped sound hole, and a floating bridge and a tailpiece. And importantly, they have an internal kind of box thing, is probably the best way to describe it. It's like a baffle that is bent into a curve and comes up around the front side of the sound hole. It creates this sort of channeled effect for the sound, and also there's a sub back to it that can't be damped by the player's body. For bracing, they're ladder braced in kind of a distinctive way, fairly minimal bracing. Macaferri approached the Selmer Company of Paris and asked them to basically start a subdivision to build these things, which is kind of gutsy because Selmer was and is famous as a producer of woodwind instruments. They weren't really guitar guys. So Selmer said yes, and they got the shop up and running in early 1932. But within a year or two, Macaferri seems to have just kind of lost interest in the project, or somehow faded into the background, because they took his name off the headstock, they crossed it off the label, and then eventually some additional changes to the design happened. The sound holes on some models became very small and oval-shaped, rather than big and shaped like a D, as in Mario's original design. This one seems to be a weird amalgam. It's larger, but it's oval, so it's somewhere in the middle. They made tenor guitars, 7 strings. Some of them were designed for use with gut strings, others for steel. They did a Hawaiian lap guitar, harp guitars. But by 1952, Selmer decided to get out of the guitar business entirely. Fewer than 1,000 guitars total had been made in those 20 years. so they're incredibly rare. And in the 60s or early 70s, if you wanted to build one, you didn't have a whole lot of reference material available. People could copy the outlines from pictures, but the insides remained pretty much a mystery to most builders outside of France. Over the years, Michael Dunn here managed to get more and more accurate with his design. However, I mean, he could also be persuaded to build something like we have here, which is a hybrid. This has got a pin bridge, which is unusual. There is a companion to this guitar, and at some point the action on both of them seems to have risen to unacceptable levels. The owner had another repair person shim the underside of this fretboard to account for that. Remember, these are built like traditional classical guitars with an integral heel block and Spanish-style slipper foot. The neck isn't a separate piece, so it can't be pulled off to change the angle. Anyway, the other guitar is fitted with a bridge doctor and hasn't suffered the same fate as this one. The action right now is beautiful. It's 4/64ths on both bass and treble, but the saddle is way, way too tall. It's about double what it should be. It's currently just about 3/16ths of an inch at the D string, which is like 5.5 millimeters tall. And, you know, that's especially tough in this case because there's very little distance between the pinholes and the back of the saddle. And so these low strings, the break angle is really extreme. And the bridge itself is positioned on the guitar in such a way that the saddle is just about in the midpoint of the bridge, which is a little unusual. They're usually quite a bit farther forward. Maybe some concessions were made to have the pins in the place where they are. So we'll have a look inside and see if there's any clues. This design, as I said, is usually built with a floating bridge. It's quite narrow, and a tailpiece. So it's not subjected to the kind of forces that this normal style of pin bridge produces. And for that reason, the soundboard in this might be thinner and fairly lightly built, because that's part of the secret to the characteristic tone of these things. You've got that sharp staccato attack with almost instantaneous decay. You know, it's not a long, sonorous note. Interestingly, flamenco guitars function in much the same way, and they're built like this as well. Fairly lightly built with a low bridge, a very thin soundboard. So you get that rapid-fire sound. The label says it was built in 1969. This is guitar number 61. And it also has another penciled-in note there saying rebuilt in 1970. Now, I'm not sure what that means exactly. Maybe the pin bridge was an addition. I do know that this was apparently a very early experiment in using a pin bridge, so who knows. The instrument's fairly big. It's a full 16 inches across the lower bout, which is like as big as a big dreadnought. The side depth on this is also pretty deep, or it feels that way, because there doesn't seem to be any taper in the side depth from top to bottom. Usually there is, you know, the measurement up here will be significantly less than in the lower bout, but in this case it seems to be about 4 1/8 of an inch all the way across. I'm not sure if I've ever shown this contraption before, because I don't use it a lot. You know, when I'm doing the neck resets, you always see me projecting a straight edge across the top of the frets to see how it intersects with the front top of the bridge here as well, and then checking with the string tension and then with the string tension removed to see how things change there. Because there's a folding action on a guitar that sort of manifests in two ways. Either the neck comes forward, and sometimes the soundboard deforms. You know, we get the hump behind the bridge or a dip in front of it. It's nice sometimes to be able to isolate what's actually going on in both of those areas. And this thing, which is just a beam with a cheap dial indicator, a couple of movable feet, allows me to measure what goes on with that hump in the bridge. So I can see just how flexible the soundboard really is. And this can also help predict whether, you know, the bridge doctor is going to do very much. Okay, so the strings are now completely slack and floppy. And we'll see what's happened here. Gonna rock it back and forth to find the sort of sweet spot there. And this soundboard has moved approximately 11 thousandths of an inch. So this pulls up 11 thousandths of an inch under tension. I'm going to go back and do the same thing, checking on the front surface of the bridge as well. As I'm loosening the strings, I can see it moving farther and farther. It seems to dip in front of the bridge by at least 15 thousandths of an inch, closer to 20. Yeah, so 20 thousandths of an inch, which is interesting. I think the bridge doctor might be a help to us in this situation. Current phone doesn't really want to fit. Have to go with the old phone. On the inside, there's a bit of a surprise, because rather than ladder bracing, this has got an X. And there's a bridge pad, which is positioned in such a way that the pinholes are pretty close to its front. You can see there are remnants of a piece of tape, and there are a couple of little splits which have developed between individual peg holes. It's very thin in comparison to most bridge pads. This is only about 1 millimeter thick. Behind the pad, you can see that it's been braced with 5 fan struts, and those are almost parallel to each other. There's very little splay to those, and they don't cross very much grain. So these function to stiffen the top longitudinally, but not across the grain. This is very flamenco guitar in concept. It's not unlike some Santos Hernandez or Manuel Reyes patterns I've seen. Projecting the plane of the frets towards the front of the bridge, I see that we've got 23/64 between that and the soundboard, which means that the plane of the frets is about 5/64 above the top surface of the bridge, which in my mind, it will be rare, exceedingly rare, for a guitar top to move that much. So it seems to me that this was overset, unless there was some major change in humidity where the top was extremely domed during the setup procedure for the neck reset. With string tension off, the figure is now 20/64, 3/64 difference. So if I'm right, by adding the bridge doctor, we should be able to prop this area up, that 3/64 of an inch. If we remove that from the total saddle height, that's going to bring us down to approximately 1/8 of an inch of exposed saddle, which is okay. That's fine. Maybe we get an extra 64th out of it, which would be kind of perfect. I don't think it's ever going to be fantastic in terms of the break angle for the lower strings. I've checked out the intonation. The low strings intonate perfectly. The high strings could actually move forward slightly, but just looking at where they're taking off on the saddle, they seem to be coming off the back edge, so there should be enough leeway in the thickness there. I've explained the JLD bridge doctor before. There's a little foot which contacts the bridge pad under the bridge, and a dowel which contacts the end block of the guitar. And by adjusting tension against that dowel, this acts as a lever and prevents the front surface of the bridge from dipping down. It's quite effective. In this case, we've got 2 issues actually. Number one is the bridge pad that's in there is very close to the front side of the pinholes. There's not really much contact area for this foot. The other thing is the pins themselves are very close to the back end of the bridge, and I think we're just going to make it in terms of placement of a screw. I'm going to have to be very careful that the screw hole is the right size so that there's never going to be any binding between it and the ebony, because if this shrinks over time, it would really want to crack through the pinholes. So just going to have to be really careful. I think the sensible thing to do is to make a bridge pad overlay. I'm going to sand what's there down some so that it's fairly level with the front surface of the pad. It's only about 1 millimeter thick. And then I'm going to make a larger pad which extends forward so that there's a good place for this to bear against. And it too should also help to stiffen this area in front of the bridge as well. Planing, planing, planing. Sawing, sawing, sawing. Got a little flat block with some sandpaper on it. It's a good idea to clean the gluing surfaces of rosewood with a little bit of acetone to degrease it before trying to glue it. To help position the bridge pad overlay, I've got these machine screws wrapped with tape so they're a snug fit, and they'll be waxed so they'll be easy to remove. With glue on the overlay, I can sight down through the pinholes and get the screws in place. And then we'll get some clamps on it. When the glue has had a chance to dry, I'll drill through the bridge pad overlay, making sure to back up my work on the inside with a block of wood to prevent splintering. Like I say, it's going to be pretty close. I'll just sketch around the screw head so that I have some idea of where to drill. I'll use an old school egg beater hand drill to do this so I can sneak up on things and make sure I'm not going to go too deep or too fast. Then I'll drill the through hole for the bridge doctor's screw. I just chucked the screw into my drill press and reduced the diameter of the head slightly because it was a very snug fit in the hole. And, given this thing's proximity to the back of the bridge and the pinholes, I want there to be some clearance. I've also enlarged the through hole, a little bit so that in the event that this bridge should shrink at any point, maybe during the winter months or something, it'll be less likely to crack because of this. Okay, I remove the set screw from the threaded portion of the jig here, and I've inserted the dowel. It's useful to have that in place when it goes into the guitar, so you're not trying to do it when it's installed. And this is always a little bit of a fun thing, lining up the hole in the back side of the jig with the screw. Then I'll push the dowel through to the end block and try and align things so that it's parallel with the center line. Sometimes it helps to look at things. Now I'll take a short pencil, reach in and mark the place where the dowel enters the jig body. Now I have to trim the dowel about 3/8 of an inch shorter than this line. Okay, this gets reinserted in the jig. Actually, before I do that, I should re-ream the peg holes because it would be awkward otherwise. You really do have to get in there and look with a mirror to make sure the dowel is lined up with the center of the end block. It's not hard to go astray. A little bit of angle here equals a lot on this end. And if it is offline, you lose a lot of the efficiency. The leverage isn't nearly as good, so it's got to be straight. Now I can put the little set screw in, which will bear against the end of the dowel and provide that upward lift. Now here again, I can use my gauge to keep track of the progress. To disguise the screw hole, I have a 1/4 inch plug cutter here, which I'll run into some scrap ebony. Just going to put a little dab of paste wax inside the grooves of the screw head. In the future, if someone ever wants to pull this out again, it'll make it a little easier for them. We'll see how this plug fits. For some reason, my plug cutter always makes them a little bit too large, which is very annoying. So I almost always end up having to sand slightly to reduce the diameter. Do a little dab of fish glue. And try and get the grain lined up fairly symmetrically. And let that dry. When dry, we cut. And then we sand. This will disappear pretty nicely. It's still visible if you know what you're looking for, which is a good thing, but it's not readily apparent. With the saddle back in place and strings on, I can check out the action and discover to my delight that we've got 6/64ths on bass and treble, which means I can lower the saddle by a 1/16 of an inch. I'll sneak up on it to make sure I don't overshoot. And there we go. Much better. You know, the thought originally was that I was going to have to pull off the fretboard and resize or make a new wedge to go under it. However, by pushing up that dip in the soundboard, we've managed to lower the saddle height by a full 1/16 of an inch, 1.6 millimeters, basically a third of its original height. It went from being way too high to the upper boundary of what we consider normal. The saddle now isn't pulling forward because, you know, less of it's exposed, and the brake angle is less extreme. That low E is always going to be a bit of a tight squeeze just because of its placement, but you know, it feels less like it's in danger of slingshotting the pin right up and out of the hole and into your eyeball, you know? And realize this is not the typical expected outcome from the bridge doctor. Usually it's employed to lower a big hump behind the bridge, which has the added effect of slightly lowering the action too. In this case, because it dipped more than it humped, the effect was reversed, and that was good. Among other things, it saved the customer a bunch of money. It's a fascinating guitar. It feels like a hybrid. It's somewhere between Django and a more typical flat top, which I suppose is to be expected given its construction. But it's got a really nice voice, good and loud. Let's play it.